start, and presumably some other folks will come along and join us. So for now, for the last few Zoom sessions, we're just going to try to do as best as we can to have some discussion about those sort of early chapters in the book. So you can, and part of the reason I want to do this gives you the opportunity to sort of see how to synthesize this material and ask sort of ethical questions about it, which presumably will help you write your papers, but also it just gives you the chance to sort of dialogue with each other rather than me just sort of rambling on about what's in those things. So I sent you all this morning an email, and these questions, obviously, because we're going to look at this chapter today and tomorrow, so these questions will sort of just hold true for tomorrow as well, and then we'll have chapter 2 to look at. So the first thing, I started us off on this journey on Friday when I started talking about how we got to where we are today, which is the sort of overarching theme of chapter 1. And really, some of what I talked about on Friday was really based on Roderick Nash's first essay, sort of what, the old world roots of opinion, and sort of understanding of nature and humans' interaction. So, so the question there is, what were 3 basic ideas in that essay that, and anybody can sort of chime in.
I have one. Correct me if I'm wrong. It says first immigrants approached for North America with a cluster of preconceived ideas about wilderness. Did you hear me, or should I speak louder?
No, well, just don't hold the paper so much in front of you. You're muffling it. But yeah, so the preconceived, so this first immigrant had preconceived notions of wilderness. And what were some of those preconceived notions? And anybody can chime in. Mindy doesn't have to be the only one to answer it.
But they talked about how one of their preconceived notions was that the wilderness was evil and that they tried to get away from that.
Okay. Yep. Anybody else with another preconceived notion that they had? So definitely the wilderness was evil.
I guess based on what India said, I guess they thought it was evil based upon just kind of early scriptures and mythologies that sort of had this notion that there were these, all kinds of monstrosities and beasts and demons contained in the wilderness. And I guess that sort of tied in with how we, it was just the opposite of what we wanted as a species. We wanted to survive, and, it was just filled with hardships and possibly death.
Yeah. Okay, great. All right. So what was another basic idea that was conveyed in that first essay?
I guess sort of the frustration of, early on anyway, not being able to sort of tame the environment, our sort of ongoing battle with sort of, I just guess, dominating the land so that we could survive, have an easier time, and just sort of thrive as a species.
Yep. And part, and that frustration really was related. Here comes Donald. That frustration was really related to the fact that, technology just wasn't adequate to suppress nature, if you will, and suppress the wilderness. All right, so picking up what Danny said there, anybody else have some notions or observations on that sort of frustration that the early settlers had? Or contrasting that to how the Native Americans interacted with the nature. How was that?
Not so much the Native Americans, but the Japanese and Chinese cultures. It talked about how they had more of a reverence to wilderness
Yep.
and like shown it in a much better light than the Westerners.
Right. And the Native Americans would have had that too, but exactly, that's exactly right. And so if you have that kind of reverence for nature, what does that sort of imply about your interaction, or what type of interaction you might have with nature then?
I guess it'd be more harmonic.
At least on the surface, right?
Yeah.
And you would be less interested in just overtly dominating nature and more trying to work with it. All right. What was another basic sort of idea that came out of that first essay by Nash? Yeah, go ahead, Donald. Yeah,
I just wanted to apologize for being late. I looked at the wrong link for Zoom meeting. My bad.
that's okay. Don't worry, you're here. So anybody else have one other basic thing that came out of that first reading there by Nash? Abigail, you got anything for us?
Um, I don't. I'm looking and I'm just thinking about Kuo Xi, the 11th century Chinese master of landscapes, and
Okay.
I'm just thinking about how values affect art and then art affects life. I I don't have really food for thought.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So certainly that the way we understand our values certainly shape art, and actually as you go forward and we explore this a bit more when we get to Emerson's sort of essay on nature, you're going to see how he defines beauty. And so he had some sort of symmetry and understanding about in the same way that the Asian sort of culture does with nature and beauty. All right, let's go to the second essay, and this one was by George Marsh. And what does it mean? What does the geographical influence of man or humanity mean in Marsh's essay? What's he implying by that statement? Yeah. Yeah. So anybody have?
Yeah, I can try and give it a go.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we affect geography, our land around us, in I guess a multitude of ways, both positively and I guess mostly negative. In order to procreate as a species, to move forward technologically and to advance, we affect the land around us by constantly, I guess for lack of a better word, ruining it while moving forward. And but also, we aim to improve it as well so that we can sustainably move forward. But I think sometimes when we go forward with how we approach things environmentally, we don't think about the ramifications of our actions, and sort of netted us where we are now.
Well, and so geographical influence also plays in. There's a strong sort of sense here. Look at how often we move riverbeds or
Sure.
or sort of the direction of the flow of water, and sometimes the sort of results of that movement of sort of the physical direction of water, sometimes it is positive and sometimes negative. The other way we influence geography, at least sort of, I think part of what Marsh is trying to get at is, you're right, that we always change geography whenever we try to construct something, right? We're changing the physical geography as well as the landscape. And our influence on geography, therefore, can is is not just a negative and positive. It also is a reshaping of geography, and so it puts geography into a um, sometimes it remakes it into something completely different, right? And sometimes we eliminate the uh, what was there in front of us. We blow up a part of a mountain to do strip mining, right? And so we're influenced geography and topography when we do that. When we build roads, we slice off the sides of cliffs, or bore holes through hills and stuff. And so our influence is has a lot of positive value for human society, but it can have some significant negative consequences for the nature itself, particularly when we shift the direction of water or those kind of things.
I guess what I was trying to get at too, if you don't mind me stepping in here,
Go right ahead.
it's just I guess we value ourself as
Yeah.
humans more than geography and the land itself. And
Okay.
we have these varying values, but for whatever reason, culturally we value ourselves at being the utmost of importance.
Sure. And do you think Marsh was trying to imply that when he was talking about
Oh,
it?
for sure.
Okay, good. Excellent. All right. So he talks about the destructiveness of man, and obviously, Danny, you started to hint upon that. But what else is Marsh implying by the destructiveness? And obviously, the time he's writing, he's using man as a term for all of humanity. But what's he implying when he's talking about the destructiveness of humanity here?
I think he's kind of talking about how we inadvertently destroy the land around us and also ourselves, kind of by like changing cities and like rulers and all of that kind of stuff.
Okay. One thing I might modify your statement there, because our manipulation of things around us isn't necessarily inadvertent, okay? It often has the inadvertent consequence of destroying the things that we're manipulating and inadvertently hurting us as well, right? But but the actual manipulation is often very intentional, right?
Yeah.
And so certainly he recognizes
Well,
that.
let's not
Go ahead.
well, let's not forget that there's also part of the destructiveness of man that they're also adding like water and air pollution. They're polluting uh, they're polluting the air and water by having a power plant of some kind. I think that's another way for destructiveness of man. Does
Yeah.
that count?
Well, I mean, in general, that's how we're destructive. But is that what Marsh is talking about? Specific things? I think what India is trying to imply here is that Marsha was showing us that the interplay between nature and humanity can lead to our own destruction as we're manipulating these environmental factors. What else might he have been implying there with that sort of uh, overarching title of destructiveness of man? Anyone? All right. Well, let's look at his last the heading that I want to focus on, and that's the physical improvement. What would physical improvement look like? He begins to talk about this, but what is he sort of driving at when he says physical improvement will look like? Right. Anyone with sort of physical improvements?
Well, there may be like there may be some kind of partial reverse situation from destructiveness of man, and how to be able to not allow that from happening, not only to us, but not allowing the destruction of nature to happen either.
Okay. Okay. All right. So what else might he be driving at?
I guess to move forward from this point, I think we have to change our morality and our way of thinking in order to sort of actually make any kind of meaningful change going forward.
Okay.
Another way of saying repent.
Well, certainly, there is some notion of repentance if you want to take it from a religious context, and we do have that responsibility, even if you're not religious here. But I think Danny's exactly right. One of the things that, in order to have some possibility of improvement, we have to engage in a new model and a new relationship with the earth, right? Because we can't have the possibility of reversing the destructive nature that or course we've been on without framing a new model. And so in that new model has to have some recognition of the wrong we did, right? Whether it's the notion of repentance or not, we have to acknowledge that we've somehow damaged these things, and we've damaged ourselves in that process, or we can't really move forward. You know, and that also, if you look at how he lays these things out here, we might have to begin to not just have a new relationship with nature, we might have to rectify. That doesn't necessarily mean restoring things, but if we've chopped a lot of trees down, we may have to plant new trees, right? So there also has to not just be the recognition and a new relationship going forward. We may have to somehow replace or repair the damage that's happened in the past as well, in order for that improvement to take shape. All right. Emerson. So the only thing I want to look at in Emerson is his notion of beauty here. And so what does Emerson mean by beauty, and not simply that beauty is in the eye of the beholder? He's pushing at something deeper than simply just, if I see something and deem it beautiful, it's beautiful. What is he really trying to drive at here with his notion of beauty?
I think I think he's probably driving beauty as in you are who you are, and that's a beautiful thing. It doesn't matter how you're made. You're beautiful inside and out.
Yeah, but
That's the true beauty of being yourself.
yeah, but he's looking at beauty not from the human standpoint here. Where is he looking at beauty? What's he framing around beauty?
I think he's framing beauty around the concept of something divine.
Okay, yeah, but he wouldn't use that term, would he?
Right, no.
Okay, so
Abigail was.
Abigail has the sense of beauty as well. Exactly. So Emerson's a transcendentalist, right? So he certainly has some concept of the transcendent, right? So beauty is in that sense, that larger context. So it does include what Donald was driving at. Um, and yes, he's talking about beauty sort of, although he might not use the term divine, he does have a sense of transcendent, and both Danny and Abigail pick up on that. But he's particularly talking about beauty in the terms of how we understand nature. And so what's the relationship there of beauty and nature?
Spiritual.
Okay, so again, so all three of you now are sort of in this, so there is a spiritual component to nature. And so that may be how he would quantify, and I like the fact that each of you have picked up this notion of a transcendent or divine quality towards nature, which requires reverence, right? What else does that sort of lead us into then, if nature has that sort of divine quality, if you will? And this maybe touches on what Donald was trying to drive at, not so much about us as humans, but if nature has that presence or quality in it, what does that sort of imply we need to do with nature?
Is it more like the fact, like, to connect with its you know, sometimes there's a lot of natives who go into the woods to connect with nature, and it's more like a spiritual connection with them. They
Uh-huh.
consider it like more like a healing property.
Yep. Okay.
Or the fact that you know, there's people that believe in, it's the word homeopathy. Did they have one with nature because they believe that
Okay, a oneness with nature. Okay. There now we're getting at the notion that he's trying to convey here. So beauty is this transcendent quality that's present in nature, and it has, you know, as we talked about the other day, intrinsic value. Okay, so one of the things he's driving at with the notion of beauty is that there's an intrinsic value in nature, that because it exists, it has value simply because it exists, and that somehow we're in communion with it. And if we're in communion with it, this gets to this sort of concept or notion that if we damage it, it's also damaging ourselves, right? And if we don't see the beauty in it, we're not seeing the beauty in ourselves, you know. And so Emerson is really trying to move humanity or society into this deeper space where you really are sort of at one with nature in a sort of larger sense there. Does that make sense?
Yepers.
All right. Now we get to the fourth essay, and this essay really is about conservation. And probably as you were reading it, it probably raised some questions for you, because how does Pineau, how does he define conservation? What's the primary concept of there's sort of three basic qualities to conservation for him.
He talks about how conservation is development.
Ah, right. And that's essential, right?
Yeah.
What are the two other parts to conservation?
He said preservation of
It's also meaning.
Hold on, Donald. India had a second. Go ahead with your second point, India.
I think the second point is the preservation of waste. And
right, exactly. Right. So you're supposed to not have much wastefulness, right?
yeah.
And what's the third thing of conservation?
Also husbanding the resources for future generations to come.
Ah, perfect. Okay, there we go. So if you look at his notion of conservation, development is primary. The protection of resources is sort of secondary for future generations. And then the not having waste. If you notice, and then I didn't include this for us to talk about, but he has a rebuttal to John Muir's Hetch Hetchy Valley when he goes in front of Congress to testify about that the Hetch Hetchy Valley should be turned into dammed up for water for San Francisco. So he's a utilitarian in a lot of ways. And so what I want you to see here is his notion of conservation is primarily utilitarian in framework, okay? That the primary reason to conserve things, to protect them, is so that we can then use them for our betterment, okay? And that therefore, when he goes in front of Congress, he argues that yes, the Hetch Hetchy Valley is beautiful, and yes, it's a place that brings great joy, but he makes the point that it brings joy to a few hundred folks that can hike in there and camp in there and so forth, and that the greatest value of the valley would be to harness the power of a dam to provide electricity and drinking water for San Francisco. And so he's making a completely utilitarian argument about conservation. Now, he is sort of quantifying that things should be protected for future generations, but really so that they can use them, okay? Not simply as John Muir wants in his article for us to go and just enjoy in the sort of terms that Emerson puts out there, to enjoy the beauty of it, right? That's not what this article is about. Conservation here for Gifford is really about the use of it for our betterment as human beings, right? Is that how we understand conservation today?
I think how we see conservation today is more from like trying not to waste anything. So yes, to an extent, but
Okay, we certainly right.
and
There is an element of not wasting stuff in our conservation today, but do we protect forests today, or do we protect national parks, or do we protect elephants or rhinoceros today? Do we protect them so that then we can use them in the future, or do we protect them simply so we can have them to look at?
Probably just to protect them from, I guess, just to have them as national treasures and cultural relics.
Ah, okay. Well, that would be a very different sort of
Yeah,
understanding of conservation, wouldn't it?
yeah.
Because in that notion, we're not seeking to like
Use them.
to use them for our own benefit, aside from to go and marvel and awe and wonder at them, right?
Hmm.
But what's one of the dialogues or controversies that's happening in our federal government right now around environmental policy? And particularly, I'm thinking about logging and uh, uh, searching for oil. Where do people want to log and search for oil right now? In our context in North America. Any ideas?
Is that the Pacific Northwest?
Well, there in Alaska, so a lot of the places that they want to search for oil and log trees and do forestry and other kind of things are in our national parks or protected conservation areas. And so one of the tensions that we have in public policy today, particularly in terms of resource management, is exactly the kind of question that was going on at the turn of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, when they were arguing and fighting about whether they should submerge the Hetch Hetchy Valley in water to provide electricity and drinking water for San Francisco. We're having the same kind of argument today in conversation at a national level. Should we go into these national parks and protected forests and habitats to dig for oil, to search for oil, and to cut down trees? And people on one side of the argument are saying that's part of the reason why we protected these lands, okay? That we should be able to use them to do that, because there are national treasure in the sense that we need them to perpetuate our society. So they're making a conservation argument that, Pioche was making back, 100 years ago or so. And the other side of it are the folks making the John Muir sort of argument that no, in the sort of argument that Emerson was making, no, these things need to be there simply for their beauty. And we protected them not so we could then use them later on, but we protected them so we could visit them later on. And you see how those are, in a lot of ways, competing views of conservation and competing views of resource management, aren't they? Because one of them says we can do this responsibly and search for oil and cut down trees, and the other is saying no, that human history has shown we never do this responsibly, and the only way to ensure that we do it responsibly is to have these zones where it's free not to do it at all, right? Or it's prohibited from doing it. And so one of the things that's happening in our society is, and this is true about any kind of restriction, the boundary of that restriction is firm or permeable based on how we understand human nature. And if we think human nature can deal with some sort of permeability, we allow those boundaries to be more permeable. But when we think human nature is going to violate it totally, then we make the boundaries more solid, don't we? And so when you think about environmental ethics, that's really the challenge we have, because our nature shows that we tend to move towards the side of overusing things, right? Rather than underusing things. Is that a fair statement and a fair analysis, would you all say?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
All right. So we'll finish with John Muir and sort of seeing how we opened up the Hetch Hetchy sort of conversation, and this will be the last thing. And then tomorrow we'll look at Aldo Leopold and his notion of land ethic. So when Muir writes about Hetch Hetchy Valley, obviously one of the things you can see there is he's picking up sort of Emerson's idea of beauty. But what else? Why is the Hetch Hetchy Valley important in Muir's estimation? Why is it important?
I'll take a stab
Yeah,
at it.
sure.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go right ahead.
I guess it sort of represents like the last bastion of the purity of nature in a sense. And I think in the grander scheme, the Hetch Hetchy Valley is it sort of represents this divisiveness in how we as a country are split between our meanings of conservation, sort of what we were talking about before. So
Okay.
there's this battle, this tug of war of like what you're talking about. How do you get the most out of something, but should you protect it as well? And in Muir's case, I guess he's sort of on the side of wanting to protect this, this bastion of beautiful nature.
Right. Which, by the way, he lost. So
Yeah,
just
that's right.
win. Abigail, you were going to say something?
She said it's sort of caught in the battle between good and evil. His holiness mild and evil.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. So she's sort of framing it really in the larger sort of cosmic sort of question here. That the sort of, but one thing that we need to be careful about framing that in a cosmic sort of sense is that nature doesn't have a moral intention, if you will. We like to see nature often as evil or good, depending on how we view it and what it is we're talking about. The cuddly puppy or kitten or whatever we see as good, and we see the bear, that the grizzly bear is evil. But nature itself doesn't have morality. Okay, and so really, if we want to see the sort of cosmic battle of the Hetch Hetchy, it's really the sort of the two sides of human nature, the desire to control the wilderness and use it for our own devices, and then the sense of Emerson's idea of accepting and seeing the beauty of it and enjoying it purely for its beauty. Okay. And so that's really what's happening. That's the significance of this piece of land that Muir is trying to talk about. Is, thanks Abigail for the thumbs up, that he's trying to make the point that in this, and Danny's right, it may be the sort of, although obviously we know there are other places on the planet that are equally beautiful, maybe even more beautiful than that valley was. None of us living today know what the beauty was because it's filled up now with water, so we actually don't know what the beauty was. But there are all kinds of natural, beautiful places on the planet, and we're always confronted with this problem when they're undiscovered. Okay, when the natural, beautiful place is undiscovered, the question always arises: does it actually have beauty if it's not discovered? Right? And so it's like, does the tree make when it falls and there's no one there to hear it? Does it make a sound when it falls? That great philosophical question. But the other philosophical question is, does beauty exist if there's no one there to see the beauty? And from an environmental perspective, if we accept the notion of intrinsic value, if we accept that notion, then beauty does exist even if there's no one there to see it, okay? Because it's simply beautiful because it exists. When we experience the beauty, then we're confronted with the next question. Do we share that beauty with other people, right? Because we know if we share it with other people, what's the likelihood that will happen to that beautiful place? Right. It's likely, Mindy said abused or destroyed. I mean, what's likely to happen is people will eventually congregate there to look at it. And initially they'll admire and awe at the beauty. But then they'll want something more from it than just the beauty, right? And we'll begin to seek something else that we can gain from it. And so in one sense, the selfish person or the true conservationist might say the best thing for the beautiful spot is to never tell anybody else, right? The perfect example in environmental ethics is there's some trees and some other things that are known to be, like there's a small patch of trees that are known to be the oldest trees on the planet, okay? And botanists and some other folks have studied these trees, but they will not share the location with anybody of where this patch of trees exists. And the reason they won't is for fear that someone would come in and try to destroy or damage or harm them. And so you're stuck then in between this sort of, weird space where you've discovered this and know that this exists, but you feel compelled to hide it from its location from everybody else because you think it will be abused or destroyed. And so that's how I would see that sort of that cosmic battle that Muir is trying to put forward here. And of course, Muir is advocating on the side of protecting it. And as I said, unfortunately, he lost the battle. It was flooded, and now it provides electricity and water for much of the San Francisco Bay Area. The problem is, if any of you know this, that it's not enough now, right? And so now San Francisco and the water district and all of them are working on ways to increase fresh water flow to San Francisco by creating a whole system of tunnels and aqueducts in the sort of Bay Area, because they have to get more water there. And so now San Francisco is in its next phase of the same kind of question that Muir put forward, more than 100 years ago. How do we protect the Bay Area and still provide water and electricity for the community? So they're sort of back to the same place they were a century ago. But they don't have a Hetch Hetchy Valley to fill in now, and flood. They have to do something else. All right. Questions, thoughts, and then we'll just anything. All right. Be mindful that Go ahead with your question.
Oh, okay. Okay. Did I miss anything first part before I came on the Zoom meeting?
No, and it will be recorded. I recorded it, so if you did, you can always catch up back on the recording. Just remember that you got your first response and ethical analysis due on Friday. And tomorrow we'll look at Aldo Leopold's land ethic and what that means. And so see you all tomorrow. Take care.